Hey guys, tonight we descend into candlelit chambers draped in velvet and soaked in secrets. Thick tapestries barely muffle the creaks of ancient beds and the whispered moans behind stone walls. The air smells of musk, incense, sweat, and something unspoken. Beneath golden crowns and gleaming armor, kings hid appetites as dark as the dungeons below their castles. They were not just rulers of land and law, but of flesh, of fear, of twisted pleasures enforced by power. And you're about to walk through it all. You'll trail behind royal guards as they usher trembling girls into royal chambers. You'll pass through velvet curtains and find yourself standing in the same room where kings demanded obedience in bed no matter the cost. You'll see how sex was never just intimacy. Here it was a game of dominance, control, and spectacle. And what happens when that power turns perverse? When a man raised to believe he is God's chosen vessel is left alone with his desires. You probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing where this sleepy little kingdom reaches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It begins in the heart of France. You're standing in the limestone halls of the Château de Vincennes near Paris. The year is 1322, and King Charles IV is pacing barefoot across his bedchamber floor. His mood is sour. His last mistress was dismissed for whispering the wrong name in bed. He's brooding not out of loneliness but boredom. Sex for Charles is not an act of passion, it's an act of inspection. Women were summoned like livestock, stripped and paraded. He called it cleansing the bloodline, as if virginity, symmetry, and docility could guarantee royal heirs. The women were chosen not just for their beauty, but for their silence. They were expected to say nothing, feel nothing, and above all, resist nothing. Tonight, two noble sisters are brought in. Both are just past puberty. Charles's chamberlain bows as he presents them, eyes fixed to the floor. The girls stand trembling, dressed in white linen chemises. One glances up and Charles notices. He smiles. That little defiance excites him. He makes a note to send her to the tower after. See, kings like Charles believed they were beyond mortal judgment. Their bedchambers became courts of their own, where women could be elevated, exiled, or executed, depending on how they performed beneath the sheets. In the medieval imagination, a king's virility was tied directly to divine favor. If crops failed or wars were lost, the blame often pointed toward the queen's womb or the king's lack of control over it. And control is everything. You wander deeper past the chamber and into the summer room, where the windows are shuttered and candles burn low. This is where Charles kept the tests. Objects designed to probe a woman's chastity. Rituals designed to verify her cleanliness. He believed no future queen should enter his bed without submitting to these humiliating trials. There were physicians, of course, who devised methods to judge whether a woman was intact. But Charles, he preferred to see for himself, and he wasn't alone. Cross the channel with me. We're now in Westminster Palace, and it's cold. English winters have a way of creeping through the stone like fingers. In the mid-1300s, King Edward III ruled here not as perverse as Charles, but no less obsessive. He believed in prophecy. He believed that sleeping with a virgin on the eve of a battle would guarantee victory. And so before campaigns, Edward's men scoured the countryside not for horses or grain, but for virgins. They were paid or coerced to spend a night in the royal tent. Some were told it was a blessing, a religious duty. Others were too afraid to resist. Most never spoke of it again. What Edward didn't realize, or maybe didn't care to admit, was that his reputation haunted the court long after the battles ended. It wasn't just the women who were terrified. Even noblemen feared leaving their daughters in his presence for too long. But perhaps the most horrifying king of all was found further east. Let's walk now to Hungary. It's the 15th century, and King Sigismund of Luxembourg has locked himself in his tower again. Not for prayer, not for strategy, but for what he called the trials of obedience. Women were brought to him in silence one by one. Many of them were already pregnant wives of nobles, sometimes even servants from the kitchens. Sigismund believed that impregnated women were closer to divinity, more charged with the essence of life. He used this belief to justify unspeakable acts. He would strip them and paint their bodies with oils made of myrrh and animal fat. Then he'd lie beneath them completely still while they blessed him. If they moved incorrectly, spoke or wept, they were taken away. Some never returned. One midwife reported that she found scratches on the stone floor near the tower door. Bloody fingerprints, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. It was all done under the guise of holy vision. This is the dangerous thing about kings. When you're raised to believe you're chosen by God, your darkest urges begin to look like rituals. Your perversions feel like prophecy. No one dares question you. The church blesses your children. The court toasts your virility. And the women are just instruments in a long, painful song. And as you begin to drift now with that soft fan humming and the lights dimmed just right, we're not done. We'll return to England next. A red-haired tyrant waits for you there, his appetite more monstrous than all who came before. His name is Henry, and he's only getting started. You step softly now through the damp corridors of Hampton Court. The year is 1536. The scent of roasted meats and sweat from the kitchens drifts upward through the floorboards. But here in the royal apartments, the air is laced with rosewater and dread. You pause at the door. A scream is muffled. A slipper lies abandoned in the hallway. The red-haired tyrant waits within. Henry VIII. To the world, he's a Renaissance king, patron of the arts, defender of the faith, bold architect of a New England. But to the women who shared his bed, he was a creature of terrifying contradictions. One moment, tender, poetic, adoring. The next, brutal, suspicious, and bloodthirsty. And always insatiable. Henry's appetite wasn't just sexual. It was spiritual. He believed he was destined to reshape England and that his divine mission required a male heir. Every wife, mistress, and court beauty became a vessel for that obsession. And when they failed him, when their wombs betrayed him, they ceased to be women in his eyes. They became obstacles, threats, or worse, enemies. Anne Boleyn learned this too late. You're there with her now in her chamber the night before her arrest. She's pale, brushing her long dark hair as the shutters rattle. Outside, the wind howls like a bad omen. She knows something has shifted. Henry hasn't visited in days. The servants are quiet. Her ladies-in-waiting avoid her eyes. Somewhere in the chapel, prayers are whispered for her or against her. She cannot tell. What Anne doesn't yet know is that Henry has already begun sleeping with Jane Seymour. And he isn't just sleeping with her. He's preparing her, testing her, to see if she can give him the son Anne could not. Jane is kept in a separate wing, hidden, doted on, inspected. Henry touches her belly every day like a farmer checking soil. He wants to plant his seed in fresh ground. The cruelty lies in the silence. Anne is not told. She is simply discarded slowly, publicly, and with just enough spectacle to make an example. The charges against her: incest, adultery, witchcraft, all whispered by men desperate to survive the wrath of a king who had grown bored of her sharp wit and flashing eyes. You walk with her to the scaffold. You feel the chill of the morning air as she kneels. She doesn't cry. She doesn't beg. The sword flashes, and her head falls gently into the straw. And Henry, he feasts that night. Jane will be his third wife, but not his last. You glide now through the years like smoke. Catherine Howard is next, just a girl, barely 17. Henry is old now, his body bloated, his leg ulcerated and weeping. The once dashing king is now a rotting lion, but his hunger has not faded. He marries Catherine because she is young, vibrant, and most dangerously naive. She giggles in the corridors, dances barefoot, and blushes when Henry calls her his rose without a thorn. But Catherine has secrets, and in a court like this, secrets are fatal. She had lovers before Henry, real ones, passionate, reckless moments that meant something. But when these are discovered, when jealous courtiers whisper into the king's ear, Catherine is not spared. She is interrogated, stripped of her titles, imprisoned. When she is told she will die, she begs to have the executioner's block brought to her cell so she can practice laying her neck properly. She is 19 when the axe falls. Henry moves on. He always does. And you begin to see a pattern now. These kings, they do not make love. They make symbols. Each woman is a warning, a statue, a story. Their beds are not places of tenderness, but stages where obedience is tested, where bloodlines are gambled, where punishments are delivered with frightening finality. But England wasn't the only stage for this cruel theater. Let's travel south to Castile. The Iberian sun beats down on the Alcázar. Inside, King Peter of Castile, later known as Peter the Cruel, sits in a room adorned with Moorish tiles and silk curtains. His gaze is sharp, but his heart rotten to the core. Unlike Henry, Peter didn't need the excuse of religion or heirs. His depravity was personal. Peter had a mistress named Maria de Padilla, a woman of remarkable beauty and wit. She loved him perhaps foolishly and bore his children, but Peter was not faithful. He collected women like coins. Some were nobles, others were peasants. It didn't matter. What mattered was control. One of his wives, Blanche of Bourbon, was locked in a tower days after their wedding. He visited her only once more before poisoning her. Another mistress was flayed alive after he accused her of mocking his virility. Peter enjoyed watching. There were rumors that he would disguise himself at night and sneak into convents, choosing girls at random and dragging them to his private chambers. No one could stop him. He was king. The church stayed silent. The court trembled. And you begin to wonder how many of these kings ever knew love. But love in medieval courts was a dangerous word. Love meant vulnerability. Love meant giving something of yourself to someone else, and these men raised to believe they owned everything never learned how to give. They only learned how to take. You pass through a quiet corridor now. No torches. Just moonlight. Somewhere a woman sings to herself in a language you don't understand. Her voice is soft, mournful. You stop, you listen. It's the only moment of peace you've found in this castle of ghosts, and then it's gone. Because there's another king waiting for you now. His name is Vlad. His castle sits on the edge of a cliff in Wallachia, and his pleasures, they are the darkest yet. You may want to brace yourself, because next we descend into the lair of a man who saw pain not as a punishment, but as foreplay. You cross a narrow stone bridge suspended over mist-soaked ravines. The wind howls like a grieving widow, and wolves cry in the distance. You've entered the Carpathians where the forests are thick, the mountains silent, and the stories even darker. A jagged fortress looms ahead carved into the side of a cliff. This is Poenari Castle, and its master Vlad III. You might know him by a different name, Vlad the Impaler, son of the dragon, or perhaps simply Dracula. But before he became the bloody legend, he was a prince, a ruler, and yes, a king in all but title. And his bedroom was as much a chamber of horrors as his battlefield. Vlad didn't just kill, he crafted death like an artist. His punishments weren't acts of rage, they were rituals, theater, warnings. He believed that fear was the purest form of loyalty, and nowhere was that belief more disturbingly present than in his most intimate moments. You walk now through one of the tower chambers. The windows are narrow slits. The floor is uneven stone. Chains dangle from the walls, not rusted, not ancient, but used. And recently, the mattress in the center of the room isn't luxurious. It's rough fur over straw. But the women who were brought here didn't come for comfort. They were gifts offerings, sometimes tributes from terrified nobles who hoped to curry favor with Vlad. And he accepted them with a smile. But his smile meant nothing good. To be chosen by Vlad was not an honor. It was a sentence. His tastes were cruel and precise. He believed that pain purified the soul, and he enjoyed watching that process unfold. One account from a Saxon merchant tells of a girl who displeased Vlad with her silence. She wept but didn't scream. That enraged him. He ordered her feet sliced open and sprinkled with salt. Then, as she twitched and sobbed, he embraced her, whispering that she was becoming closer to God. Another time, a young woman refused to disrobe. Vlad said nothing at first. He simply ordered her servant girl beheaded in front of her. Then he turned back, now smiling, and said, "Try again." She did. And yet Vlad did not see himself as a monster. He saw himself as just, divine, chosen. He argued that he only punished the wicked, that every act of torment served the larger order of the world. And in his eyes, the women he brutalized were never victims. They were temptresses, sinners, vessels of chaos that needed correction. You can feel the weight of his gaze even centuries later. The way he moved through his court like a wolf in a monastery. Nothing escaped him, and no one dared refuse him. But perhaps the most disturbing ritual of all was what he called the blood vigil. This is where it gets hard to breathe. Vlad believed that his virility was linked to his brutality, that he grew stronger the more he fed his rage. So on nights of special ceremony, often before a major battle, he would summon two women. One he would treat gently, kissing her hands, calling her a saint. The other he would destroy slowly, methodically, until the walls of the chamber dripped with proof of his power. Only then would he choose which to bed. And still the church said nothing. Why? Because Vlad kept the Ottomans at bay. Because he brought order to chaos. because he was the devil they needed on their side. But you need air now. You step back into the cold night and stare down into the valley. Somewhere below, peasants still whisper of his cruelty. Not with anger, but with awe. His legend survives because fear is a stubborn thing, and so are kings. Yet Vlad wasn't unique in his cruelty. He was just honest about it. Others kings in the polished courts of Italy and Austria were just as depraved. They just hid it better. Let's travel west again. You arrive in Florence. The Renaissance is blooming. Art, science, and poetry fill the streets. But in the palaces of the Medici, there's a different kind of hunger. Lorenzo de' Medici, though not a king by blood, ruled with a king's authority, and he shared the appetites of his crowned cousins. He believed beauty was sacred, but not in the way you might think. Lorenzo had a private chamber filled with statues not of gods or heroes, but of young boys. Each was modeled after a real servant, a court page, a street performer. He kept them locked away during the day and summoned them by candlelight at night. He didn't see them as people. He saw them as muses, instruments. And he wasn't alone. The church whispered of his inspired lust, but Florence depended on him, so nothing was said. One poet of the court described a scene where Lorenzo painted gold across the chest of a sleeping boy, then lay beside him, without touching, just watching, whispering prayers to Venus. Others weren't so lucky. Some boys vanished. Others were found wandering, dazed, unable to speak of what had happened. Power does strange things to a man's sense of morality. You're beginning to notice that, aren't you? Whether it's the frost-bitten towers of Wallachia or the marble halls of Florence, one thing binds these men together. Impunity, the ability to turn bodies into canvases, to turn sex into spectacle, and to walk away unpunished. These were not isolated cases. These were not fringe rulers. These were the architects of kingdoms, the fathers of dynasties, the figures carved into history, books, and cathedral windows. And their beds were altars of fear. But now the air shifts again. You hear bells tolling, distant metallic. We're going north, past the forests of Saxony, past the brothels of Prague, into Scandinavia. A frozen kingdom ruled by a man with a mind fractured by war and a libido shaped by violence. He was known as Eric the Mad, and you'll meet him next. Snow crunches beneath your feet as you pass under a towering arch of gray stone. The wind bites through your cloak, sharp and unforgiving. You're in the north now, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, where the land is frozen, and so it seems are the hearts of men. The year is 1439, and the man who rules here is known across the continent not for his wisdom or bravery, but for something else. Eric of Pomerania. He was crowned King of Norway at age 7, King of Denmark at 15, and King of Sweden not long after. But power came early and twisted him young. The court spoke of his unpredictable mood swings, his erratic judgments, and his chilling sense of justice. But it was behind closed doors in the royal hunting lodge tucked deep in the forests of Holland where his madness was truly unleashed. You approach that lodge now. The doors are carved with runes, symbols meant to ward off evil, but they didn't work. Inside the room smells of pine and iron. Deer antlers line the walls. A fire crackles in the hearth, but the warmth doesn't reach your skin. In the center of the room lies a bed of furs, wolf, bear, fox, all stitched together with care. And standing over it is Eric, broad-shouldered and wild-eyed, drinking from a cup carved from human bone. His tastes were unorthodox. Eric believed in blood rites, pagan rituals repurposed into private ceremonies of lust and control. Women were brought here, not noble women, but oracles, witches, even prisoners of war. He claimed their energy was different, untamed, mystical. He would strip them, bind them with braided horsehair, and perform what he called the frost cleansing. It began with melted snow poured slowly, deliberately over their skin as they lay shivering. Then came the oils, heated animal fat mixed with herbs and hallucinogens. Eric smeared it over their bodies while chanting prayers, not in Latin, but in Old Norse. He believed this summoned the gods. He believed he was chosen to tame the wildness in them, through domination, through pain, through ecstasy. But the worst part, he kept records. You stumble upon a book, leather-bound, stained at the corners. Inside drawings, diagrams, lists of names, notes on which rituals produced the purest responses. He measured tears. He recorded the pitch of screams. He considered himself a scientist of sensation. And the court. They whispered of it, yes, but they were afraid. After all, Eric also had a habit of throwing dissenters into the frozen sea. Eventually, his madness could no longer be ignored. He was deposed, stripped of all 3 crowns. But even in exile, he continued his rituals. On the island of Gotland, he rebuilt his chambers. Smaller now, but no less cruel. They say a merchant once heard chanting coming from the cliffs at midnight, followed by silence. Just the lapping of waves and a single gold crown drifting in the surf. But Eric's legacy lived on, because madness once royal never truly dies. You leave the cold now, grateful to return to warmth. But not safety. No. You're heading to the east again, into the palaces of the Russian czars, where opulence masks obsession. And one particular czar used religion not just to justify his desires, but to engineer them. His name was Ivan, the Terrible. You step into the Kremlin, the floor beneath you, glowing with polished malachite. Gold leaf covers the ceilings, and every wall is painted with saints staring down in disapproval. But Ivan isn't ashamed. He's proud. To him, holiness and horror walk hand in hand. Ivan grew up tortured, abused, neglected, then suddenly handed absolute power. The result: a man who saw suffering as a gift, especially when it was meted out by him. He believed that love must be tested with fire, that loyalty must bleed, and that women existed to carry his wrath in their wombs. He created what he called the Holy Chamber. It looked like a chapel, candles, incense, crosses, but it was anything but sacred. Here Ivan would summon young women, mostly daughters of boyars who had failed him in court. They would be dressed as angels, white linen, golden halos painted on their foreheads, their hands bound in prayer. Ivan would make them kneel, confess. Not their sins, but their beauty, their desire. He would force them to describe how they had tempted him, even if they never had. Then he'd absolve them. With touch, with punishment, with penetration framed as purification. One girl, barely 13, was said to have died mid-ritual. Ivan had her buried in the cathedral courtyard and built a fountain over her grave. The water, he said, would make the flowers bloom better in spring, and no one dared remove it. Because by now, Ivan had created the Oprichnina, his private secret police. Cloaked in black, skulls sewn into their saddles. These men didn't just spy. They delivered women to the holy chamber. They silenced witnesses. They buried bodies beneath the palace floors. And yet Ivan wrote poetry. He played music. He sent lavish gifts to convents. Because kings like him never saw themselves as monsters. They saw themselves as martyrs. You walk through the chamber now. You feel the wax from the long-burnt candles beneath your feet. The incense still clings to the air, sickly sweet. And the silence, it's deafening, because no one ever screamed here. They prayed instead. And now we leave the churches and chapels behind. We move west once more into the Germanic kingdoms, where one emperor decided that obedience wasn't enough. He wanted transformation. He wanted to break women down, then build them up in his own image. His name was Frederick, and his empire. It was forged in blood steel and some of the most chilling bedroom experiments in medieval history. You're about to enter the lab of a king who treated sex as alchemy. The firelight dances along the steel instruments lining the shelves. You step cautiously into a vaulted chamber beneath the imperial palace in Palermo, Sicily. The year is 1235. This is the underground laboratory of Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Germany, Italy, Sicily, and Jerusalem. A man praised as a polymath, a philosopher king, a ruler fluent in 6 languages, patron of science, builder of universities. But here, in the candle-lit depths of his southern stronghold, Frederick is not experimenting with astronomy or medicine. He is experimenting with women. He called them subjects. His notebooks refer to them only by number, age, and physical traits. To the outside world, Frederick was enlightened. But to the women kept in this secret wing of his court, he was a meticulous predator. A man obsessed not just with the body, but with what he could extract from it, emotionally, sexually, biologically. Frederick believed in eugenics centuries before the word even existed. You see it now in the instrument's metal rods used to measure skulls, hooks for posture correction, herbal tinctures for manipulating fertility. He selected women from across his empire, peasant girls, noble daughters, even slaves bought from foreign markets. They were isolated, studied, groomed. He called it shaping perfection. But the truth is, he wanted to play God. You approach a chamber lined with mirrors, not for vanity, but for analysis. Frederick would observe the women as they undressed, as they washed, as they performed dances taught by court tutors. Any signs of hesitation or shame were recorded. He believed sexual shame was inherited, that purity was a flaw. Women who blushed too often were removed from the program. What was the program exactly? He called it the Embodiment Project. His goal was to create the perfect consort, not just in appearance, but in behavior, voice, rhythm of breath. These women were drilled in posture, moaning technique, eye contact, and even crying on cue. It was performance meets punishment. And the final test, obedience in arousal. Frederick believed true submission wasn't fear-based, it had to be internalized. He used a series of escalating rituals. One involved binding a woman in silk and feathering her skin for hours before introducing sharp ice. Another was starvation paired with rhythmic music until the woman associated hunger with melody, then pain with affection. You can't help but wonder, was this about control or curiosity, both? Frederick's writings show a man who didn't think he was evil. He saw his cruelty as noble. He believed he was crafting not only the perfect sexual partner, but the future of womanhood. One passage reads, "To rule a body is easy, but to rule a soul that is artistry. He took girls as young as 9, kept them for years. Some were released wedded off to courtiers. Others were never seen again. But perhaps the most disturbing detail, he invited scholars to observe. Philosophers, physicians, even clergy. They watched from hidden balconies, took notes, debated the results. They called it the Mirror Court. It was a grotesque symphony of science and sadism, all under the guise of imperial progress. And yet Frederick was beloved by many. His court wrote poems about his wisdom. His campaigns across Europe and the Holy Land were praised by chroniclers. He was called Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. None of them wrote about this room. You leave now the air behind you thick with incense and silence. But what Frederick started did not end with him. The idea that women could be shaped in the shadows of power became a quiet tradition among elite men across Europe. It echoes next in Spain. We return to Toledo in the late 1200s, a city of scholars, philosophers, and yes, confessors. King Alfonso X, known as the Wise, built libraries, translated Arabic texts, reformed the law. But inside his fortress, he created something else entirely. La Cámara de Redención, the Chamber of Redemption. It sounds hopeful, doesn't it? It wasn't. This was where women were sent to be purified, those suspected of lust of defiance or simply of seducing the wrong man. Many were servants accused by jealous noblewomen. Others were courtesans who had grown too bold. And some were victims of the king's own shifting moods. You enter the chamber now, and it's unlike the others. No instruments, no chains, just silence. The floor is sand, the walls padded. A priest stands in the corner murmuring prayers. In the center, a woman on her knees, blindfolded arms raised like a penitent. King Alfonso believed sin must be confessed with the body. That repentance had to be enacted again and again. The women here were forced to reenact their crimes. If a woman had kissed a man in secret, she would have to kiss an iron mask repeatedly until her lips bled. If she had seduced a knight, she was made to describe the act slowly, repeatedly, to a panel of judges until her voice cracked from exhaustion. And then came the redemption. Alfonso would arrive alone, cloaked, silent. He would circle them, whisper prayers, touch them gently at first, then not so gently. The line between religious ritual and sexual domination blurred completely. He believed that only through reenactment could temptation be expelled, that each act of humiliation restored divine order. You realize now that confession for men like him was never about forgiveness. It was foreplay. And these kings, Frederick, Alfonso, Ivan, they were not aberrations. They were milestones, each one refining what the last had begun, the transformation of women from partners into projects, from companions into controlled experiments. But we are not done, not even close. Next, we sail north again, across the cold Atlantic, into the misty highlands of Scotland, where one king didn't just use fear or science or faith, he used theater, because James of Scotland believed that sex was a performance, and his lovers, they were the unwilling cast, and the curtain's about to rise. The air is wet and heavy with peat as you cross the moors of medieval Scotland. Fog coils around your ankles like a living thing. You hear hooves in the distance, muffled laughter, and the low rumble of drums. A wooden fortress looms ahead, perched on a rocky cliffside above a black, roiling sea. You've arrived at the court of King James I of Scotland, and tonight the show begins. James, crowned in 1406, was a poet and musician, a refined man schooled in England with an eye for verse and a taste for elegance. But behind that courtly charm lived a mind twisted by captivity. He had spent much of his youth as a prisoner of the English, raised in shadows, molded by surveillance and discipline. So when he returned to Scotland and seized his throne, he didn't just crave power. He craved spectacle. And sex to James was a kind of theater. Not a private act of pleasure, but a public lesson. A ritual designed to reinforce hierarchy. And he built a literal stage for it. You step into the great hall of his coastal castle. The walls are lined with stained banners. But at the center is something strange. A raised platform surrounded by heavy curtains. Candles burn in iron sconces. A velvet throne sits just off stage. This isn't a chapel. It isn't a court of law. It's a theater of submission. James called it the Chamber of the Rose. Here he would host what he euphemistically referred to as performances. In truth, they were elaborate bedroom punishments disguised as morality plays. Women were brought in as actresses, often unaware of the role they'd been forced to play. Each scene was scripted by James himself, and each night he was both playwright and lead actor. He wrote them in verse, little stanzas of torment, rhymed instructions for how the wicked maid must confess her sin, or how the wayward wife would learn to obey through passion disguised as penance. These plays always ended the same way, with the woman bound in silk surrounded by courtiers in masks, and James descending from the shadows to deliver his final line whispered just inches from her ear, and then the lights would go out. What happened after that was never written down, but the servants talked. The musicians who played harps to drown out the cries, they talked too. And what they described was a king who reveled not just in domination, but in direction. He told his lovers where to stand, how to scream, when to kneel. He choreographed every second. And if a woman failed her role, she was replaced, sometimes exiled, sometimes married off to distant lords. One poor noblewoman, Margaret de Bruton, was sent to a convent after forgetting a line in her assigned script. Another was said to have disappeared entirely after daring to laugh during one of James's scenes. Her name was stricken from the royal ledger. Her belongings burned. James justified it all with poetry. He published a collection of love sonnets during his reign, beautiful on the surface, but filled with strange language about control, taming wild roses, and quenching the fire of disobedience with the balm of night. The court praised it as genius, but the women of the palace read it as a warning, and the most disturbing detail, he sometimes made them perform for others. Noble guests, foreign envoys. These weren't orgies, they were pageants. James believed that if women played their parts well, they could elevate the crown, that his mastery in bed would translate into political dominance. Sex became diplomacy. In one infamous performance, a young French envoy was treated to a scene titled "The Taming of Lady Faithless." The actress, a chambermaid no older than 16, was dressed in gold-threaded robes, then slowly stripped on stage line by line, while James recited his verses. The envoy applauded. The girl never spoke again. What you're realizing is this: for kings like James, the bed wasn't just a place to lie. It was a platform, a classroom, a stage, and it didn't end with him. His obsession with performance echoed through the Stuart dynasty. Later, kings continued the tradition of sexualized court theater, though in subtler ways. Masks, banquets, feasts that blurred the line between entertainment and exploitation. James just made it explicit. But now we leave the velvet curtains behind. The fog rolls in thicker now, almost choking. We board a ship. The sails billow as the wind shifts us south back to the continent, to the Low Countries, to Burgundy, where a prince turned king had a very different philosophy. If James wanted women to play their roles, this man wanted to strip them of identity entirely. His name was Charles the Bold, and he believed that sex should be anonymous. You arrive at the ducal palace in Dijon, lavish, extravagant, hung with Flemish tapestries, but tucked behind the formal gardens lies a low stone house, unremarkable, quiet. This was Charles's sanctuary, but it wasn't holy. Inside, everything is dim. The windows are shuttered. The rooms are soundproofed. There are no portraits, no crests, only candlelight and silence. And one rule above all others: no one speaks their names. Charles had a fetish for anonymity. Women were brought here blindfolded, bathed and dressed in identical linen gowns. They were forbidden to speak, to look him in the eye, or to express any recognition. He would spend hours in this place, moving from room to room, assigning each woman a letter, never a name. He called them his choir, because moans to Charles were music, and the more anonymous, the more beautiful. He claimed that names ruined desire, that the moment a woman became real, she became political, messy, unruly. But if she was just M or S or L, she could be pure, unshaped, a vessel, and he didn't stop at names. After each encounter, the women were sent to confession, but not to a priest, to a scribe, a monk who recorded their experience not for penance but for documentation. Charles wanted to read their reactions later, in private, with wine. You can still find those confessions in the archives of Bruges. Dozens of pages written in trembling hands. Some are poetic, others are broken. One reads, "I felt myself dissolve. I became the shape he wanted. I was never myself again." And still Charles was adored, brave in battle, loyal to his allies, a statesman. Because what happened behind shuttered windows never touched the throne room. But it will touch you. Because next we traveled to Bohemia, where one king turned his entire court into a prison of pleasure. And every woman was a prisoner, whether she knew it or not. You drift now over the mountain passes into Central Europe. The forests grow thicker, the rivers slower, the castles colder. You've reached Bohemia. The court of King Wenceslas IV waits behind stone walls so dense they seem designed not to keep invaders out, but to keep something trapped within. Maybe him. Maybe the truth. Wenceslas wasn't born cruel. He was born bored. Crowned at 17 in 1378, he inherited not just a throne, but an empire stretched across too many provinces, too many problems. His response, indulgence. He withdrew from the world, retreating into chambers lined with fur satin and carefully controlled silence. He called it his sanctuary. Others called it a prison. You pass through the gilded archways of Prague Castle, but instead of state rooms and advisors, you find a corridor leading underground. There's no light, just flickering torches and the faint scent of myrrh and something sour beneath it, something decaying. This is the king's Domus Carnalis, the house of flesh, and it is nothing like you've seen before. Unlike Charles the Bold, who wanted anonymity, or James of Scotland, who wanted performance, Wenceslaus wanted possession. He didn't collect women, he trapped them. The Domus Carnalis was a network of interconnected chambers, each housing a different woman, each carefully selected for her age, voice, height, and temperament. They were not guests. They were not courtesans. They were not even mistresses. They were roles. Wenceslaus called them the circle, and each woman was assigned a time of day: morning, noon, dusk, midnight, and so on. He moved through them like clockwork, 1 hour with each. No words, no deviation, no choice. He believed that regularity purified desire, that repetition erased guilt, and each chamber was themed. The morning room was painted with pale yellows, filled with the chirping of birds in cages. The woman there was always dressed in white, her breath perfumed with mint and milk. She was to greet him with a smile regardless of mood. The midnight room was a cavern of black silk, low music, and forbidden incense. The woman there was to pretend to be asleep when he arrived. He would enter silently, always silently, and lie beside her, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours. He never spoke to any of them. His guards referred to the chambers only by number. The women were not allowed to speak to each other. They were fed separately, their meals passed through small slits in the wall. They were watched constantly by eunuchs, by scribes, by priests who took notes under the guise of moral counseling. You pause now outside a red door. The dusk room. A journal survives from one of its occupants, a young noblewoman named Irina, taken from her family under the pretense of becoming a royal concubine. Her words are shaky. He doesn't hurt me, but I feel undone. I've stopped counting days. I hear no voices but his breathing. Sometimes I wonder if I am still real. This was Wenceslaus's brilliance and his sickness. He didn't need chains. He used routine, silence, isolation, the removal of identity. Over time, the women stopped resisting, not from fear, from erosion, and still he was called pious. Wenceslaus considered this entire ritual a spiritual practice, a form of moral control over his lustful nature. He claimed that by controlling how, when, and where he acted on desire, he was better than other kings, holier, more refined. He even invited bishops to observe. One wrote, "The king's passions are arranged like a cathedral, each chamber an altar, each woman a hymn." But that cathedral was built on broken minds. Eventually, whispers spread. His wife, Sophia of Bavaria, demanded the release of the women. He refused, claimed they were there by divine design. When she threatened to leave, he threatened to lock her in the evening room. She never mentioned it again. It wasn't until his political enemies gained power that the House of Flesh was disbanded. The chambers were destroyed. The women were released, many too broken to return home. Some entered convents. Some simply vanished. And Wenceslaus, he died of a heart attack. Alone. Slumped in a chair beside the dusk room. The birds in the morning room were the only ones who noticed. But Bohemia wasn't done with its kings. Because Wenceslaus wasn't the only ruler with a dark appetite. He was just quieter about it. His cousin Sigismund. Yes, the same Sigismund you met earlier in Hungary took that same craving and turned it outward. Made it public. Made it political. Because Sigismund believed that sexual domination was not just pleasure. It was policy. You now return to Buda. The palace has changed. Grand halls echo with song and firelight. But deep beneath the marble floors, past the guard posts and kitchens, lies the gallery. It isn't made of paintings. It's made of people. Sigismund created it late in his reign, a rotating collection of living portraits. Women posed in frozen scenes, clothed in sheer silks, suspended by ropes or chains, or glass supports to hold them in impossible positions. The goal, to turn flesh into art. But the truth, it was humiliation. He invited ambassadors to walk among them, tour them like one would tour a museum. Each woman had a plaque beside her listing only 3 things: age, origin, and sin. That's how he justified it. Every woman in the gallery had committed a moral crime: infidelity, disobedience, vanity, ambition. And this was her sentence. He claimed they were being reformed through stillness, that holding a painful pose for hours or days would cleanse them of desire. But many collapsed. Some died. And still the gallery continued, because kings like Sigismund understood something terrible. That when you wrap abuse in ritual and poetry, in stained glass and velvet, people stop seeing it for what it is. But you see it. Even now, centuries later. You feel it in the stillness, in the echo of high heels on cold stone, in the silence that follows a scream too long stifled. And you're not done yet. Next, we leave Europe altogether, because across the Mediterranean, in the gilded courts of the Levant, another kind of king waits. One who believes that women are not to be tamed or broken, but consumed. He is the lion of the Mamluks, and his hunger knows no end. The scent of cardamom and rosewater clings to your skin as you enter the heart of Cairo. It is the 14th century, and the city breathes with gold and dust, fire and silk. Above the rooftops rise the domes of mosques, their minarets slicing the sky. But beneath the call to prayer, another rhythm pulses, slower, deeper, more dangerous. You're in the court of Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad Lion of the Mamluks. He ruled Egypt 3 separate times, weaving his way through power exile, and return with the cunning of a serpent and the roar of a beast. His palace shimmered with marble fountains and inlaid gold, but beneath that beauty, his appetites slithered unchecked. He did not merely want women, he devoured them. You are ushered past guards in black robes down corridors thick with incense. The sound of running water follows you. The harem is not a place of quiet submission here. It's a kingdom all its own. Women from all corners of the known world are kept within these tiled walls. Circassian girls with silver eyes, Abyssinian dancers, Syrian singers, Persian poets. All hand-picked, all purchased, and none of them free. The Sultan did not call them concubines. He called them offerings, not to God, but to himself. Each woman was renamed upon arrival, stripped of her past. Their original names were burned in a ceremonial brazier at the center of the garden. It was called the Fire of Forgetting. You reach the central chamber, a massive octagonal room ringed with cushions, silk drapes, and mirrors. At its center is a raised platform covered in fine blue linen. This was his feast table, and the feast was flesh. Al-Nasir believed that a woman's beauty should be unveiled like a prayer, slowly with reverence, but also with force. He did not bed his women in private. He turned sex into ritualized pageantry. Courtiers were sometimes invited to watch, not to participate, but to witness. Their silence was required, their obedience total. You notice something strange about the room. The mirrors don't face the center. They face inward toward the women, so that in his words, they could watch their surrender. One scribe recorded an event titled "The Night of 7 Flames." in which al-Nasir chose 7 women, each painted in a different fragrance: musk, myrrh, jasmine, cedar, camphor, amber, and ash. They were made to lie in a circle around him. As the music played, he moved from one to the next, blindfolded, identifying them by scent alone and punishing the ones he misnamed. Punishment wasn't always violent. Sometimes it was exile to the Hall of Echoes, a small, dark room where women were locked alone for weeks, surrounded by mirrors, and low, murmuring voices piped in from above. The purpose: to drive them into obedience through isolation and illusion. But other times, the punishments were worse. The Sultan had a fondness for power games involving his highest concubines. The top 3, known as the crowned daughters, were pitted against each other in contests of sensual obedience. They competed to please him, to guess his desires, to anticipate the rhythm of his moods. Those who failed were demoted, or worse, gifted to foreign emissaries as tokens of diplomacy. He called it the dance of ascension. The records show that some women rose through this brutal hierarchy. One, a former slave from Anatolia named Halime, became his favorite and ruled the harem for nearly a decade. But even she lived in fear. When a new girl arrived from the Levant, Halime was forced to train her personally, teaching her everything from posture to submission techniques. She vanished within the year. No explanation. No funeral. Just a pair of slippers left outside the marble bath. You begin to understand, to the Sultan, pleasure was not indulgence, it was control. The more you gave him, the less you remained yourself. He believed that breaking a woman's sense of self made her more beautiful. That love was not something shared, but something taken, reshaped, and held in trembling hands. And if any woman tried to resist, there was the garden of no return. You walk through it now, a walled courtyard behind the harem, lush with pomegranate trees and night-blooming jasmine. It seems serene, peaceful. But beneath the soil lie bones. This is where the Sultan's most rebellious women were brought. Not to be killed, but to be erased. They were made to kneel in the moonlight, bathed in scented oils, then buried alive up to the neck, left for a full day and night, while poetry was recited around them. A ritual of humiliation, of helplessness. If they survived, they were brought back in silence and placed in the lowest rank of servitude, forbidden to speak, forbidden to be touched. No one ever saw them smile again. And yet al-Nasir was hailed as a hero, a patron of art, a defender of Islam. Historians praised his architecture, his diplomacy, his generous rule. His cruelty was hidden behind high walls, behind veils, behind the delicate phrasing of palace scribes who dared not write what they truly saw. But some fragments survived. You hold one now, a poem unsigned, written in ink, made of crushed lilacs and blood. It reads, "I entered his arms, as a woman I left as a shadow of silk. My name was burned, my voice forgotten. But he calls that devotion." You step back into the palace corridor, the air now suffocating with the weight of so many forgotten voices. You pass the guards again. They do not look at you, and still the Sultan feasts. But we are not done. Now we sail west past Sicily, past Aragon, into the dark corners of Portugal, where a king once fell so deeply in love with a dead woman, he crowned her queen. But his love, it was anything but pure. Because in Portugal, necrophilia wore a crown, and you're about to witness the coldest coronation in history. The sun sets heavy and orange over the hills of Coimbra. Cypress trees sway gently in the wind. Birds nest in the eaves of ancient monasteries. Portugal in the 14th century is a land of sorrow and sea foam, of longing glances and quiet betrayals. And at the center of this stillness lies the most tragic love story ever embalmed in royal power. But don't be fooled. What you're about to witness isn't a romance. It's possession wrapped in poetry. You step through the ivy-covered gate of a monastery tucked high in the mountains. The tombs are carved from white limestone, the halls echo with Gregorian chants. And lying there in eternal repose is a woman who was crowned after her death, crowned not out of love but obsession. Her name was Inés de Castro, and the man who loved her was King Pedro I of Portugal. You see, Inés wasn't a queen, not officially. She was the mistress of Pedro, heir to the throne. Their affair began in secret, as all doomed romances do. But it blossomed into something far more intense, far more dangerous. Inés was noble, educated, and fiercely intelligent. Too intelligent, some whispered. Pedro's father, King Afonso IV, saw her influence growing. The court began to murmur that Inés was manipulating Pedro, using her beauty and wit to place her family closer to the throne. And so one day, while Pedro was away hunting, Afonso had her murdered. They found her near a fountain, her white gown soaked in blood, her throat opened with surgical precision. Her children, Pedro's children, were hidden away. And when Pedro returned, the story should have ended there. But it didn't. Because Pedro didn't just mourn. He unraveled. He ordered the arrest of Inés's killers, and when he found them, he didn't simply execute them. He had their hearts torn out, one through the chest, one through the back. He watched every second. And then came the coronation. 2 years after becoming king, Pedro had Inés's corpse exhumed. Let that settle for a moment. He had her dug up, the body cleaned, dressed in regal robes, her long dead face veiled with silk and scented oils to mask the decay. And then before the stunned court, he sat her on the throne. He crowned her as Queen of Portugal, and he demanded every noble in the kingdom kneel and kiss her hand. You are there now in the candlelit hall. The silence is unbearable. The nobles are pale, wide-eyed, trembling. The body of Inés sits slumped on the throne bones, wired into position, jaw stiffened to form the semblance of a smile. The veil hides the worst of it, but the stench of death still clings to her even beneath the perfume. The nobles approach. They kneel. They press their lips to cold, gloved fingers. Some weep, some retch. Pedro watches it all with glassy eyes. What he did next was perhaps even more disturbing. He had 2 matching tombs built, one for himself and one for Inés, across from each other in the monastery, so that when Judgment Day came and they rose from their graves, they'd meet eye to eye once again. He called it love. But this wasn't love. This was fixation embalmed in authority. And behind the veil of poetry, Pedro's obsession didn't stop at the throne room. Rumors spread that he had visited her nightly while her body lay preserved in a private chamber, that he spoke to her, fed her, laid beside her. Some whispered that the queen's room was kept guarded, candles burning rose petals refreshed daily. Others claimed the guards heard him moaning. It's impossible to know what's true. But in Pedro's reign, fear and awe mixed in equal measure. His power rested not only on royal blood, but on myth. And Inés became that myth, a martyr, a goddess, a symbol, and yet not a woman anymore. She had no voice in any of this, no choice. Even in death, her body was used, displayed, touched, revered not for who she was, but for what she meant to him. Her final coronation was not an honor. It was a final violation. You walk now between the twin tombs. The marble is cold beneath your fingers. Each stone coffin is carved with the same words, Ate o fim do mundo, until the end of the world. But what world was this one in which a woman could be loved to the point of desecration, revered to the point of rot? You leave the monastery, the evening light now drained of color. The sky bruises purple. You think of all the queens and lovers before her, how they were turned into dolls, prisoners, statues, notes in a play, letters in a gallery, ghosts in a garden, and then finally into a corpse, crowned queen. But necrophilia was not just a metaphor here. In medieval courts, the line between mourning and madness blurred easily. And if you think Pedro's story was singular, you're wrong. Because in Eastern Europe, another king would take it even further, not by crowning the dead, but by preserving their parts. Because in the next kingdom we visit, love meant collection. And the king, he had a cabinet full of memories, each one bottled, dried, marked with the name of the woman it once belonged to. And you're about to see inside. The horses snort in the mist, their hooves muffled by the soft moss of a Transylvanian forest. Pine needles crunch underfoot as you approach a castle that doesn't appear on most maps, half fortress, half prison, clinging to the edge of a crag like a blackened tooth. You're in the lost kingdom of Moldavia. The year is 1476, and behind these walls waits a king whose legacy has been buried under centuries of silence. His name was Stefan cel Mare Stephen the Great, a national hero to some, a warlord to others. But in the hidden pages of history, among the servants who dared speak in whispers, he was known by another name, the Collector. At first glance, Stefan seemed a pious man. He rebuilt churches after every battle, confessed before every campaign, and kept a staff of priests at his side. But that was the surface, and tonight we step beneath it. You are led by candlelight into the king's private archive. It's not a library. There are no scrolls, just rows and rows of locked wooden cabinets. The room smells of camphor, dried herbs, and something faintly metallic. This is where Stefan kept his memories. Open one drawer, and you'll find a lock of hair braided tightly bound in ribbon, pressed between pages of psalms. Another drawer reveals a dried, curled handkerchief stained with a mark the scribes refused to identify. A third holds something worse. A small jar, inside a single finger, preserved in resin, pale and shriveled. Every item was labeled, a name, a date, sometimes a short description of what he took. Not who she was, but what she gave him. Elena, first moan. Isabella, drop of blood. Anka, last breath. To Stefan, women weren't lovers. They were moments. He didn't want them whole. He wanted pieces, a fragment to remember, to possess, to control forever. And the rituals behind these collections, they were as disturbing as the cabinets themselves. You walk now through a stone passageway deeper into the fortress. Here the torches burn blue from copper salts. The walls are lined with icons, holy images, weeping saints. But their eyes seem to follow you. In this room, Stefan performed what he called the severance. The process was precise. After bedding a woman, often one who had pleased him in a particularly new or unexpected way, he would ask for a gift. But not a necklace, not a ring, a piece of her. Sometimes it was symbolic. A few strands of hair cut with gold-handled scissors. Sometimes a drop of blood drawn from her palm. But other times, it was not symbolic at all. One account found decades later in a scribe's private journal speaks of a young noblewoman named Adriana. She came to the castle as a guest, unaware of Stefan's tastes. After a feast, she was led to his chamber. She never left. The next morning, the court was told she'd taken ill and died in the night. But in Stefan's cabinet, behind a locked panel labeled A1574, was found a velvet pouch. Inside, a perfectly preserved tooth, and a note written in Latin for the sound it made against my skin. You back away now. Your breath catches in your throat. Because these weren't just keepsakes. They were trophies, and Stefan's obsession was never questioned. Why? Because he kept the Ottomans at bay. Because he was devout. Because he donated richly to monasteries and fed the poor. Feast days. His people loved him. The church canonized him. But the women, the ones who lived behind these walls, they weren't remembered, just catalogued. And the most chilling part, the collection was only ever meant for him. No one else was allowed to see it. Not his advisors, not his family. Only a single eunuch scribe, blind and one-eye tongue cut out, was permitted to maintain the archive. His job was to update the labels, dust the jars, replace decayed wrappings. He died shortly after Stefan's final campaign, and with him, the last key to the catalog was lost. Some say the cabinets were burned after the king's death. Others claim they still lie hidden beneath a forgotten chapel. Waiting. Preserved. Eternal. You step back into the night air, now gasping, the cool breeze biting your lungs. The stars above you spin like ancient watchful eyes. You think of the kings who crowned corpses and those who stored body parts in jars, and suddenly you understand this wasn't about sex anymore. Not really. It was about immortality. Each act of domination carved a name into stone. Each broken woman a step toward godhood. In a world where kings ruled by divine right, the flesh of their lovers became just another sacrament. But we're not through. Not yet. Because now we move west again into France, where the Sun King's ancestors ruled with powdered wigs and painted lips, and one in particular believed that love was a science. He surrounded himself with alchemists, perfumers, and surgeons, and he believed that a woman's arousal could be bottled, measured, studied. His name was Charles VI, and he went mad trying to trap lust in a vial. You're about to enter his perfumed nightmare, where pleasure had no scent until he made one. You smell it before you see it. The scent drifts through the corridors of the Hôtel Saint-Paul, the royal residence nestled in the heart of 14th century Paris. It's not the smell of fire or food, but something stranger, thicker, sweet but cloying, like rotting lilies dipped in honey and wine. This is the palace of Charles VI of France, and his madness is perfumed. You pass through satin-draped doors into a royal chamber unlike any other. Mirrors on every surface, velvet sheets, crystal decanters filled not with brandy, but with cloudy amber-colored fluids, some thin as oil, others thick as sap, each labeled with neat script written in Charles's hand. He believed they contained essence feminine, female spirit, lust bottled. You're standing now in his cabinet of bloom, a room Charles had built solely to study the moment of rapture, that instant he claimed when a woman passed from resistance into desire. And he believed that moment left behind a scent. He wanted to capture it. He wanted to own it. He wanted to wear it. At first he employed perfumers' artisans from Provence and Milan gifted with rare oils and flowers. But they couldn't find what he was looking for. Their perfumes were too predictable, too floral, too passive. So he turned to alchemists. You see their tools still lying on the tables, flasks, tubes, burners, tiny glass bowls smeared with dried resin. In the center of the room, a copper cauldron blackened from hundreds of strange experiments. Charles believed that women's bodies emitted a divine vapor during climax. He called it la rosée d'âme douce of the soul. To extract it, he designed what he called the lit de distillation, the distillation bed. It wasn't just a place for sex. It was a laboratory. The mattress was filled with warm sand and herbs. Beneath it, copper piping led to flasks. The headboard was lined with gauze panels that could collect skin oils, breath sweat. Every fluid was measured, every sigh recorded, and every woman carefully selected. Charles didn't use court ladies. He preferred outsiders, actresses, servants, even nuns taken under false charges of heresy. They were blindfolded, bathed in milk, dressed in gauze, and brought to the lit de distillation for study. And once there, they were never alone. Doctors watched from behind curtains. Scribes took notes. Alchemists whispered formulas. And Charles himself hovered over them, stroking their hair, whispering prayers, calling them his angels, his muses, his crucibles. He never called them by name, because names ruined the purity of the test. What he wanted wasn't a woman. It was a reaction. And the moment that reaction arrived, the moment a moan escaped, a breath hitched, a back arched, Charles would lean in and inhale, deeply, as if trying to drink it in, as if some part of her soul was slipping through her skin and into the air. He called it divine vaporization, and he was convinced it was proof that lust could be transformed into power. You walk now past the drawers that hold his vials, each labeled with a single word: hope, guilt, rain, pain, dawn, mercy, blood. You wonder what each one meant, what moment it was meant to preserve, what woman had suffered to create it. Because make no mistake, this wasn't science. It was ritualized violation, and like all rituals, it had a climax. Charles believed that once the essence was captured, it had to be worn. He had special amulets made tiny glass pendants filled with his most prized scents. He wore them around his neck, layered over his tunics. Some were even inserted into the lining of his robes, so that his body heat would release their aroma slowly throughout the day. He claimed they made him closer to God, that they protected him from madness. But his madness came anyway. One day in 1392, while traveling through the forest, Charles attacked his own guards, screaming that they were traitors sent by fire demons. He hacked at them with his sword. When he returned to court, he had no memory of it. The court called it a break, but it wasn't the first, nor the last. Soon he forgot his own name, forgot he was king, refused to bathe for weeks, then demanded rose-petal baths 5 times a day. He refused to touch metal, refused to wear clothes. Some days he believed he was made of glass and would shatter if someone brushed against him. But the distillation room, he never forgot that. Even at the height of his madness, Charles demanded new subjects. His staff obliged some out of duty, others out of fear. A few believed he was channeling something divine. Others just watched the power leak from him false like oil on stone and chose silence. Eventually the room was sealed, but the vials remained. Some still sit in dusty corners of private collections. The Louvre has one labeled Mère Mother. The wax seal is unbroken, and maybe it should stay that way. Because you begin to see a pattern now. These kings, Stefan, Pedro, Charles, they weren't merely cruel. They were collectors of the intangible, trying to preserve moans, breath decay, devotion, trying to bottle power, pin it, own it. And in doing so, they turned women into alchemy. But now you'll see what happens when kings are raised not with books or prayers, but with violence. Because next we sail to the edges of Northern Europe, where a young prince was trained from birth to see pain as proof of love. His name was Christian. He became the Mad King of Denmark, and he loved only what he could break. Snow lashes the side of the ship as it breaks through the Baltic Sea, bound for the ice-bitten coast of Denmark. The sky above is a dull slate gray, the color of old bruises. No birds sing. No light breaks through. You dock at Helsingør, where Kronborg Castle waits like a great stone skull beside the water. This is the kingdom of Christian Sasven, and no one calls him sane. Born in 1749, Christian ascended the throne young, too fragile. A sickly boy with nervous tremors, night terrors, and an obsession with discipline. He was groomed by tutors who believed that fear built kings. His lessons were given with canes, not chalk. His education soaked in humiliation. By the time he was crowned, Christian didn't love power. He only understood control, and his bedroom became the final classroom. You pass now through the marble corridors of Kronborg, past gilt-framed portraits of dead monarchs, until you reach the king's private apartments. The chamber is warm, stifling, even heavily perfumed, heavy with silence. A single chair faces the bed. A chair with restraints. Not for him, for them. Christian believed in ritualized punishment. His sexual worldview was shaped not by religion or poetry, but by violence. Not theatrical like James of Scotland. Not bottled like Charles VI. No, Christian was something else entirely. He didn't want women to perform. He wanted them to cry. Servants kept a record of his preferences. In one entry, a court chamberlain notes that Christian preferred to initiate contact with discomfort. This meant slapping. Not as punishment, but as greeting. He claimed it awoke the soul. But what follows is worse. He built a device, a hybrid between a whipping bench and a prayer altar. It was made of mahogany lined with velvet, designed to restrain women while forcing them into positions of prayer. He called it the Reformer. Women were brought to him under the guise of spiritual correction. Some were lovers of courtiers. Some were stable girls. One was said to be a visiting duchess too outspoken for her own good. Once secured, Christian would read scripture aloud as he stripped them. He believed he was burning sin from their bodies. You step closer now. The room still smells of sandalwood and copper. The walls are soundproofed, not to protect the women, but to protect him from their screams. One particularly cruel ritual was known as the atonement. The woman would be forced to name every supposed sin she'd committed, speaking into a silver funnel, so Christian could listen without having to look her in the eyes. Each confession was followed by a touch, a strike, or a command determined at his whim. And it didn't end there. He documented everything, not in words, but in sketches. Dozens of crude, furious drawings were found after his death, depicting faceless women, bent, bound, trembling, each labeled not by name but by sensation: wound, submission, redemption. Christian's madness was not hidden. The court knew. His physicians knew. Even his wife Caroline Matilda, an English princess married to him for alliance, knew. And eventually she resisted. She took a lover, Johann Struensee, the king's physician, a man who tried genuinely to bring reform to Denmark. But Christian, despite his madness, was still king. When he discovered the affair, he said nothing, at first. Then one morning, Struensee was arrested, tried, and executed by dismemberment. Caroline Matilda was sent into permanent exile, her name stripped from every document, her children taken from her arms. And Christian, he returned to the reformer that very night. But this time he sat in it himself, because his madness had curdled, and what had once been directed outward now turned inward. He began punishing himself, whipping his own back, binding his legs, pouring hot wax over his thighs, while reciting his sins aloud in the mirror. The court no longer watched. They looked away. Eventually, his mental collapse became impossible to ignore. Power passed into the hands of regents. Christian was locked in a small palace attended only by servants who had taken vows of silence. But the reformer followed him. It was dismantled and rebuilt in the new location, always within reach. He died alone. No final words, no legacy of love or justice, only drawings, only pain. But there's one final horror to uncover here. Christian left behind a ledger. Inside a phrase repeated like a curse, pain is the only true confession. And maybe that's what all of this has been. A long, drawn-out confession. Not from the victims, but from the kings themselves. Men too powerful to be touched by law, too broken to know tenderness, too warped to understand that love has nothing to do with suffering. They tried to capture it. With chains. With ink. With scent. With silence. And every time they failed. But we're not done yet. Now we step beyond the castles and convents. Because some of the most horrifying practices didn't happen in royal chambers, but in traveling courts, where war was the backdrop and sex became spoils. Next, we ride with the Teutonic Knights, where one Grand Master turned captured women into human relics. Their screams were part of the procession, and you'll march beside them. The snow crunches beneath your boots, muffling the chant of marching feet. The year is 1405, and you're riding at the edge of the Baltic frontier, where the forests are thick with silence, and the rivers run red with conquest. You follow the black cross banners of the Teutonic Order, fluttering against the pale sky. But this isn't a crusade. Not really. It's a procession of ritualized domination, and the man leading it. He is not called a king, but he rules like one. Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen. To the world, he is a holy warrior, a soldier of Christ, a defender of civilization against the pagans of Lithuania and Prussia. But behind the steel helmet and black cape lies a man who turned war into ceremony and women into sacred trophies. You arrive at the mobile command post, more cathedral than camp. Gothic arches carved from wood, draped in white and black cloth. Priests sing, incense burns, and in the center, the reliquary pavilion. That's what he called it. But it wasn't filled with bones of saints. It was filled with women, captured during raids, taken from pagan villages and Christian towns alike. They were stripped, shaved, renamed, each one assigned a title, not a name: hope, mercy, sacrifice, temptation. Ulrich believed they represented spiritual states, and he didn't simply bed them, he enshrined them. You step inside the tent and see how the women are kept, not chained, not whipped, but posed, arranged like altarpieces, their skin painted with ash and oil, their wrists adorned with tiny iron crosses, their mouths bound not with cloth, but with scripture parchments wrapped around their heads, covering their lips with verses about obedience. Ulrich called this his living reliquary. Each night he selected one woman, not for pleasure but for purification. He claimed that carnal union with a heretic could only be justified if it ended in repentance or death, and sometimes both. Witnesses recorded the ceremonies. First, he would kneel before the woman, wash her feet, kiss her hands, murmur blessings. Then the ritual would begin. It involved pain, always pain. He believed that pleasure was only sanctified through suffering, that the more a woman wept, the more holy the act became. And if she didn't weep, she was marked as beyond redemption and removed. Removed meant taken behind the black curtain. No one ever saw them again. But you hear things. The soldiers talk. One knight confessed to seeing what lay behind the curtain rows of preserved body parts, mounted like relics, each labeled with the sin the woman failed to purge. A finger for vanity, a tongue for blasphemy, a womb for disobedience. And still the church did nothing, because Ulrich sent them gifts, real relics, real gold manuscripts, illuminated with scenes of piety. His troops baptized entire villages at sword point. He built chapels, fed the poor, gave confession daily. He was a man of God, a monster with incense. And the women. They were rewritten in his journal not as victims but as visions, each one described in sacred terms. She cried like Magdalene. She bled like a saint. Her final breath rose like a hymn. The worst part, many believed him. Some of the knights began requesting time in the reliquary, claiming it helped them discipline their urges before battle. The practice spread. Other commanders created their own smaller shrines, chapels of flesh as they were called, behind closed doors. The women became routine, expected, forgotten. And as the order pushed further east, the list of nameless bodies grew. One young woman taken from a Baltic fishing village was documented as having sung in the old tongue during her ritual. For that, Ulrich had her vocal cords severed before offering her to his captains. Her title in the records, silence. But not all women accepted their fate passively. One whose real name is lost reportedly bit Ulrich during her so-called purification. Drew blood. Screamed in Latin, "Your sins will not pass through me." She was beaten, displayed publicly, then paraded around the camp in chains for 9 nights. On the 10th, she vanished. The next morning, her teeth were found inside a reliquary box wrapped in gold thread. You pass by that box now, displayed beneath the Grand Master's altar, still labeled conviction. Eventually, Ulrich met his end at the Battle of Grunwald. His army shattered, his head removed by a peasant's axe. Some say the women in the reliquary heard the trumpets of defeat and began to sing. No one knows what happened to them. The tent burned, the records scattered. But some of the boxes, the relics, were recovered, sent quietly to abbeys, hidden in vaults. And even now their inscriptions remain untouched, because to erase them would be to admit what they were. You step out of the burned chapel of canvas and bone. The snow falls gently now, burying the blood. The drums are silent, the banners fallen, but the memories remain. And this was no isolated nightmare. It was the blueprint for future warlords who'd dress conquest in the robes of ceremony, who'd weaponize scripture and call it purity. You've seen the throne rooms, you've seen the altars, but now we go to Rome, to the seat of Christendom, where popes reigned and kings knelt, and one Pope King in the heart of the Vatican held orgies in holy halls and judged women not by their sins, but by their performance. Because in Rome desire wore vestments, and the greatest violation of all, it was blessed. The bells of Rome toll gently in the distance. Their echo rolls through the stone streets over the tiled rooftops, past the fountains and frescoes and columns gilded in gold. You walk beneath the great dome of St. Peter's Basilica, and for a moment, you think you're safe. But tonight, holiness is a mask, and sin sits on the throne of God. You're entering the papal apartments of Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, head of the Catholic Church, vicar of Christ, a man whose power was absolute. And yet behind these carved doors and velvet drapes, he ruled not as a shepherd, but as a king of flesh, a king in a cassock. Born into a wealthy Valencian family, Rodrigo Borgia rose through the ranks of the church with the subtlety of a snake in velvet. By the time he was elected pope in 1492, he already had 4 children openly acknowledged. His court was not a place of silence and prayer, but of laughter, intrigue, and flesh. And in the heart of it all, the banquets. You step into a long hall lined with statues. Naked marble bodies twisted in poses of agony and ecstasy. The frescoes above depict angels, some with suggestively parted lips. This isn't a chapel. It's a stage. And tonight, the Pope is hosting what history will come to call the banquet of the chestnuts. Yes, chestnuts. Because the servants scatter them across the floor, hundreds of them, as a game. The women, mostly courtesans, many very young, crawl across the marble completely nude, gathering the chestnuts, while cardinals and bishops applaud. This is just the beginning. The Pope watches from a high-backed chair flanked by his son Cesare and his daughter Lucrezia. They are not horrified. They are entertained. You feel dizzy, not from the wine, but from the weight of corruption so dense it has become ritual. After the chestnut games come the trials. Women are paired with clergy members, not for prayer, for performance. The Pope judges, gives scores, rewards the most devout with gold coins, silk robes, or places in the papal household. There is no disguise here, no poetry, no incense, only power pressed against skin. The rooms beneath the Vatican become something else entirely. The sacristy of sin, the chapel of surrender. Behind one painted door lies what was called the room of petitions. Women were brought here to appeal for favors, marriages, land rights, absolution. But each petition required a demonstration of loyalty, and the Pope's definition of loyalty, submission. The walls were hung with velvet, the ceiling painted with lilies. There was a single chaise in the center. A bronze sculpture of the Virgin looked down. Witness, judge, ornament. Some say Borgia made the women confess as they undressed. Others say he preferred silence so he could fill the space with his own benedictions murmured as his hands explored. The most disturbing ritual was known simply as the blessing. A woman would be laid across the altar in one of the private papal chapels, her body anointed with holy oils, psalms chanted by choir boys, and as the choir reached its crescendo, the Pope would enter the chapel and lay his hands on her, not in prayer, in possession. He claimed it was a gift of the Spirit, that by becoming one with the Pope, the woman was touched by God. Some believed it. Others wept. None could speak of it. And still the Church turned away. Because Rodrigo Borgia was good at what mattered. He was a master of diplomacy, a powerful patron of the arts, a brilliant manipulator of alliances. And as long as the Vatican coffers overflowed, no one dared question how he filled his nights. But his children, they learned everything. Cesare Borgia, made a cardinal at the age of 18, followed in his father's footsteps, only bloodier. He turned seduction into blackmail. Women were taken not just for pleasure, but for leverage. The ones who refused him often found their husbands or fathers missing by morning. Lucrezia's story is even murkier. Some say she was a victim, others a co-conspirator. The truth, as always, is tangled in blood and lace. But what's certain is that the Borgia family turned the Vatican into a court more twisted than any royal palace in Europe. You step now into the Vatican vaults. There's no chestnuts here, just silence. And old documents. One is a ledger marked with dozens of names, payment symbols. Some scholars believe it was a record of confessions, others of favors. But a few pages list dates beside symbols of keys, roses, and flames. Likely not prayers. You begin to understand the final horror here. Because when sex becomes ritual, and ritual becomes law, and law is blessed by God, there is no escape, no place to say no, no space to say stop. It becomes eternal. And this wasn't just Borgia. He was simply the boldest. Other popes had mistresses. Other cardinals kept prayer girls. It was an open secret. But Borgia sanctified it. He made it holy. He wrapped sin in robes and set it on a throne. And once again the women were erased. Their names lost, their stories scattered, their bodies used in rooms designed for angels. But now we approach the end. You've seen kings build chambers, sanctuaries, reliquaries, altars, and libraries of lust. But in our final chapter, you'll see what happens when an entire dynasty across generations passes down cruelty like a crown. Where each son learns not from scripture, but from screams. Where the royal bloodline is fertilized not with power, but with pain. Next, we enter the house of Wettin, and what waits inside is the most perverse legacy of all. The gates creak open with a sound like bone grinding on bone. You're standing before the ancestral stronghold of the House of Wettin, deep in the Saxon heartlands. The castle is older than memory, its stones darkened by time and smoke and secrets. Ivy claws its way up the towers like hands trying to escape. Inside lives a dynasty and a curse. The Wettins ruled much of Central Europe for centuries, electors of Saxony, kings of Poland, dukes of Thuringia. Their bloodline was noble, their reputation impeccable. But behind the court etiquette, the music, the art, a legacy of inheritance far darker than gold. It began with Friedrich the Severe, a cold, calculating man whose passion was never for love, but for order. In the late 14th century, he created what would later be referred to in private as Die geheime Stube, the secret room. This was no ordinary chamber. It was passed down like a family heirloom. Hidden behind false panels always rebuilt in every palace they occupied, it became a ritual site for each Wettin heir. Fathers introduced sons to it. Sons inherited it like others might inherit a sword or a scepter. Inside was no throne, no books, just tools, a collection of restraints made of polished cherry wood, masks lined with fur, devices for stretching, silencing, stimulating, or humiliating, some simple, others so intricate they bore the craftsmanship of a jeweler. But these were not instruments of torture, not officially. They were for discipline. The philosophy behind the room was drilled into each generation. A king must master his body and the bodies of others. He must learn to extract loyalty through sensation, obedience through pleasure or pain. To the outside world, the Wettins were pious, intelligent, just. But behind those locked doors, they explored something else entirely. Dominans durch Vererbung, dominance by inheritance. The most disturbing example came with Johann Georg II. He ruled Saxony in the 17th century, a time of elegance and excess. He was known for his support of the arts, his lavish banquets, his refined manner. But in his private writings, sealed for centuries, he describes training sessions held in the secret room with hand-picked women from across the duchy. He didn't just dominate them. He documented them. He scored them. Each woman was given a numerical ranking based on her compliance, rhythm, vocality, and correction capacity. These metrics were compiled in books called The Ledgers of Flesh. Scholars once thought them fictional. They're not. One still exists, and you're holding it now. The handwriting is delicate, neat, too neat. Each page lists a name, often just a first name and a detailed account of the session. Dates, durations, failures, rewards. Anna unable to hold position 4. Applied punishment tier 2. Marked improvement. Greta cried during correction. Promising. Ilsa unteachable. Removed. Removed meant disappeared. The women were selected by court intermediaries, often under the guise of serving as chambermaids or singers. Some were told it was an honor. Others simply didn't understand what was happening until it was too late. And the worst part, it wasn't hidden, not entirely. Noble guests would sometimes be given a glimpse, not of the room, but of the result. They'd watch women enter a ballroom after training, moving with unnatural grace, eyes, lowered shoulders, trembling. A subtle display, a whispered brag. But the next generation, they escalated. Augustus the Strong, perhaps the most famous Wettin ruler, took the legacy and turned it into legend. He was obsessed with his own physicality, boasting of his strength, his virility, his 100 children. He referred to his mistresses as possessions of power, and they were many. But it wasn't just numbers, it was design. He would host what he called Nights of Balance. The name sounds harmless, poetic even. But it referred to a specific practice, placing a naked woman on a suspended wooden beam, arms bound, blindfolded, weights added slowly to each side until she cried out, tipped off balance, or begged for relief. He claimed it was a metaphor for governance. But you know better. You can see the structure still preserved in the basement of the Moritzburg castle. Covered in linen now, but its silhouette unmistakable. And in a locked drawer nearby, letters, written by the women, or perhaps written for them. I do not remember my name. He has replaced it with petal. He says my silence is his mirror. I prayed once. He laughed. This was the inheritance. not just of land or lineage, but of appetite, passed like scripture, polished like armor, hidden in plain sight. Even as late as the 19th century, members of the Wettin House, now scattered across Saxony, Poland, and Belgium, spoke in letters of corrective chambers of initiation nights for young princes of the touch that teaches. They saw it as tradition, but what it really was, a dynasty of erasure. No matter how many women entered those rooms, few ever left whole. Some did, some married, some lived, but none forgot. And now you stand before a sealed door in the ruins of an old Wettin estate. The key long gone, but you know what waits behind it. Velvet dust, wood metal, memory, pain dressed in elegance. And here the journey ends. You've seen kings and queens, popes and warlords, each transforming sex into something twisted, something used not to connect, but to dominate, to brand, to possess. But now it's time to let go. Close your eyes. The halls are silent, the candles are low, and all the doors are finally shut. You made it. Through the velvet corridors and blood-stained beds, through the cathedrals that whispered obedience and the kings who mistook cruelty for ceremony. You walked beside queens who were silenced lovers who were dissected, and concubines turned into relics. You saw the hunger of power not just to rule lands, but to rule bodies, and you survived. That's the strange thing about history. It doesn't sleep. It lingers, breathes, lurks in the language of elegance, hiding horror behind lace and incense. But tonight, we put it to rest. You don't need to carry their weight, their secrets, their screams. They're part of the past. And you're safe now, here, in your own quiet room, wrapped in blankets. No chains, no masks. Just breath, just stillness. Let it all go. Let your body soften. Let your shoulders sink into the bed. Hear the hum of the fan, the gentle whisper of the dark. The story is over now. There's nothing more to see, nothing more to fear. Close your eyes. You don't need to remember the names, the kings, the rituals. Let them fade. What matters is this: you're free, and it's okay to sleep now.